The refrain is so similar from Atlanta, which got one city-stopping winter storm followed by another.
It's been like nothing I've seen. I've lived here almost 30 years.
To the Great Lakes, where 80+% of the lakes were iced over for the first time in about 20 years, the buildup forming ice caves.
These were something special. I've never seen anything like it. They were as big as a garage.
People in so many different regions say they've never seen weather like this winter's. Over the past week, we've reached a point where 49 out of 50 states have had snow on the ground. We've seen so-called thunder sleet, captured in this iReport video from a backyard deck in Grand Meadows, New Jersey. But also a punishing drought in California. People in more than a dozen towns in danger of running out of water. Again, that refrain.
This is the worst year I've ever seen.
These weather patterns are severe, crazy, and connected. This winter, a high-pressure ridge of stable air blocked precipitation from coming in from the Pacific Ocean, causing California's drought. Then it pushed the jet stream further up into Canada than usual, which then led to a deeper trough in the east, pushing further south. That's why those areas got hit by cold weather from Canada.
They are associated with that long wave pattern, so they are connected in that sense.
The same jet stream wave swung into Great Britain, causing severe flooding, the wettest January there in 2.5 centuries. And yes, that same wave pattern is what's affected the Winter Olympics, making it almost summertime in Sochi. And it's all slow moving this year, holding those severe weather patterns longer over all of us. Why? A mystery.
That's an area of research that we're currently investigating. We don't have a clear-cut answer to that question. And if we did, we would have a much more skillful prediction in the longer time scale, say out to 1 to 2 months.
Another mystery, whether all this is connected to climate change or not. Bill LaPenta of the Centers for Environmental Prediction says they're still trying to crack that code, trying to determine if climate change impacts those jet stream patterns and our crazy weather.
A new warning from scientists suggesting the Earth may be on the verge of another mass extinction, similar to the one that killed the dinosaurs. And this time around, experts say we may be able to stop it. Michio Kaku is a physics professor at City University of New York and author of the new book, Physics of the Future, that we're going to be looking forward to the new book, of course. All right, Dr. Kaku, getting right to it. So which species would be most at risk?
Well, so far, if you analyze the last few hundred years of life on the Earth, human activity apparently has wiped out 1.4% of all plant and animal species, and it is 100 to 1,000 times faster than normal because of human population, development, pollution, overharvesting. And if you take a look at a zoo, many of the zoo animals that our children love, we may find them going extinct. The tiger, for example, may go extinct. Many of the familiar zoo animals, bears, and realize that 18,000 species are at risk.
And what about climate control? What role does it play?
Yeah, climate change is also involved in this thing. Independent of where climate change comes from, we see that the seasons are changing. Summers are getting longer, winters are getting shorter on average. And we always say that the early bird catches the worm, but that assumes that the worm and the bird are synchronized. Many of these cycles, the natural cycles, are being thrown into disarray, meaning, for example, droughts in China going on right now, perhaps famine in certain areas. So we humans cannot be divorced from what's happening in the natural world.
We can't be divorced. Is there something we can do about it? I guess you said pollution is one thing we can do.
Humans are among the fittest, but we are also at the top of the food chain, the top of the pyramid, and it wouldn't take much to dislodge us from being at the top of the food chain.
So who could outrank us at that top of that food chain? You know what animals I need to look out for?
Well, in science fiction, of course, the insects take over. But look at something very simple. We are dependent on just a few crops, wheat, rice, and just a few crops. And if a blight were to wipe out these crops, then a huge chunk of humanity would starve to death because we're so dependent on just a few plants and animals for our existence.
When we see extreme weather like this on both sides of the Atlantic, inevitably people start saying, is this being caused by climate change? Can we pinpoint climate change as the reason for these storms?
Officially, no. One such event you can't pin on global warming, climate change. Speaking personally, and I've got nothing, this is not the Met Office speaking, this is me speaking, I do think there's a connection, yes. We've had this record area of low pressure in the Atlantic, record typhoon in the Philippines, a heat wave in Australia with temperatures of about 50 degrees Celsius, the floods in northeast India. We're getting more and more of these extreme events as time goes on, and I'm convinced, although that's not the official line.
Interestingly, in the States, where they're seeing all of this snow, I was living there the last time they had a huge snowstorm, Snowmageddon in 2010. Yeah. And what you could hear people saying all the time was, when it was absolutely freezing cold, and saying, well, if nothing else, this at least proves there's no such thing as global warming. People are convinced that when it gets very cold, it means the planet can't be warming, and we don't need to worry about climate change. How can you convince them otherwise?
The planet as a whole is warming, but that doesn't mean to say that there won't be places that are a bit colder than before and other places that are a lot warmer. Overall, year on, year by year, the planet is slowly warming. There are these cold winters in between, but when you average it all out, the warming is continuing.
And we will need to get used to winters like this, will we? These kind of storms and extreme weather?
Well, we'll certainly have to get used to extreme weather. What the winters are like, I'm afraid I can't say, but there is no doubt whatsoever that there will be a lot more of these weather extremes in the years to come, not only in Britain, but throughout the world.
And are we very good at dealing with it in Britain? Are we going to have to get a bit more resilient, do you think, if we're going to have to get used to extreme weather?
Well, that's true. Certainly we've got to take precautions because it's a matter of life and death, some of them. And it is going to, I'm sure it's going to get worse. I can't remember the weather as it's been in the last year. I mean, it's the most vicious typhoon ever, the one that hit the Philippines.
Yeah.
Hurricane Sandy, the drought and heat wave of 2012, Snowmageddon, flooding in the heartland, all extreme events, all billion-dollar disasters, and all of them disrupted electricity and jeopardized lives. Why? Because extreme weather events are primarily centered on water. Too much or too little disrupts transportation.
Turns out that almost every single power station where you generate electricity is controlled in part by water. You have to put water in to cool things off, and as a consequence, when you can't draw water in, you have to shut down the power station.
And reduced power often leads to blackouts and brownouts, a dangerous situation if it happens in the middle of summer or the dead of winter. So if the weather is more extreme, more violent, what can be done? Get ahead of it, says the Department of Energy. Electric companies should strengthen their grids and build backup systems. Conservation and water recycling is also critical, and pre-position supplies ahead of storms like Hurricane Sandy.
People couldn't get gasoline. Gas was available, electricity wasn't. So if you had pre-positioned generators, you could actually, in fact, very quickly restore power, moving things along much more quickly than we've seen in the consequences of these storms.
And then there's money. Firming up America's energy structure could take billions of dollars, but rebuilding after a disaster could take hundreds of billions. Is the cost on the front end worth it? Pershing says yes.
Weather wallop.
Cars around me were just spinning.
Monster storms, devastating droughts. Why so much extreme weather? How can we cope with the consequences and the cost? So much of the country battered by this record-breaking winter. And just this weekend, yet another blizzard in the Northeast. Out west, an epic drought. Our panel of experts is here to examine what's behind this weird weather, what, if anything, can be done about it. And ABC meteorologist Ginger Z starts us off.
Most of the nation is in a state of meteorological exhaustion. The coldest winter in Minnesota in 33 years. The Great Lakes, almost 90% frozen. Normally, it would be just over 30. And New York City, buried, now in their top 10 snowiest seasons. Snowfall totals from North Carolina up to Indianapolis between 2 and 3 times their normal. 75,000 flights canceled since December 1st. That's an all-time record. And Pennsylvania, they've been in the heart of the misery, a giant pileup on Friday. ABC's Lindsay Janis was right there.
The sun was shining, the roads mostly clear, but there was one problem. Temperatures plummeted overnight and turned this Pennsylvania turnpike into a sheet of ice,
causing this 5-mile-long chain reaction pileup. More than 100 cars. Dozens injured.
Almost all of this weather can be related to a single pattern locked in place. All winter, the pattern has been stuck. Every time we go into the weather center here, we see the same thing. The jet stream cutting the nation in half. On the east, the coldest air in decades allowed to come as far south as the deep south, the Gulf really. And then the jet stream just right in the right place that moisture rides along it, meaning snowstorm after snowstorm from the Great Lakes through the Northeast. But that's also creating an extreme in the west. That big ridge over here gives record drought and heat. California last year, the driest year on record. President Obama traveled west Friday to see the drought up close.
What happens here matters to every working American.
Wayne Friedman from ABC 7 News in San Francisco visited a hay farm that's seen barely a sprout this year.
Ginger, what this drought is doing in California is unprecedented in 5 generations of living memory.
Friedman says the drought will affect everything from food prices to hydroelectric power.
We could see brownouts this summer from less water flowing through our rivers. For small agricultural towns, we're already seeing the effect. Some of them have 50% unemployment. Bottom line, in California, a way of living could be ending.
But are the extremes of one year related to climate change? Stanford's Noah Diffenbaugh has been working through that very thorny link. He says man-made change does exacerbate extreme weather events, meaning perhaps more intense storms, floods, tornadoes, and droughts to come. Dr. Judith Curry of Georgia Tech says climate models aren't there yet, just not up to the task of distinguishing what has caused an individual extreme weather event.
Record-breaking snowstorms. But if the globe is warming, why all the snow? Scientists make the connection.
We've always had extreme weather. We always will have extreme weather. But with global warming, we can expect to see more of these extremes.
Or will we? Our panel mixes it up over whether climate change is responsible for extreme weather and whether humans are responsible for what we're seeing.
A look at the one thing we all depend on, Earth. From the sky above to the ground beneath, how we get energy, how we use energy, and how we might be messing with Mother Nature, putting our planet in peril. First up, record snowfalls blanketing the country, deadly flooding in Australia and Brazil. Is the weather becoming more severe because of global warming? Could a hotter Earth actually mean more snow? Energy Now's Lee Patrick Sullivan went to the experts to find out in this Energy Now Spotlight.
Global warming. Scientists say the Earth is heating up so rapidly that in the next century, Greenland could have the same temperatures that Florida does now. So if that's the case, what's with all the snow?
The storm's so big it almost runs from coast to coast.
They may dub this one the monster of the Midway.
A 2,000-mile stretch of storm bringing a lot of travelers to a standstill.
For the second straight year, there have been record snowfalls. At one point, 100 million people, a third of the country, were all being hit at once.
This is the biggest snow we've seen.
And it wasn't just winter wonderlands like Chicago and Boston.
You can actually see the storm cloaking a huge chunk of the country from New Mexico to Maine.
One day this January, Florida was the only state without snow. Yep, that includes Hawaii. How can this be? 2010 was tied for the warmest year on record.
I'm gonna melt.
And according to the folks at the UN's World Meteorological Organization, the international body tracking such things, signs point to the warming trend continuing. All this cold weather is becoming fodder for pundits and comics.
What happened to global warming? Wasn't that supposed to kick in by now?
Climatologist Heidi Cullen runs Climate Central. It's a nonprofit organization that explains science to journalists.
I definitely think it's tough for people to look outside their window, see a ton of snow, and think, oh my goodness, that's global warming.
But Cullen says that's exactly what it is. Snow is proof the Earth is warming.
You know, I think it's really good to keep in mind that the term global warming doesn't mean that it's going to be warm everywhere all the time.
Here's what she says is happening. You know the video, large chunks of ice cracking and falling into the Arctic Sea. Well, Cullen says those cracks expose more cold sea surface to the atmosphere. Think of it as opening an enormous refrigerator. That cool air is packed with moisture. It travels down the Atlantic to produce more precipitation than normal. If this happens in winter, it's snow.
Less Arctic sea ice could in fact be consistent with colder winters in the Northeast.
But not so, says Professor Richard Seeger of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He believes the reason for all the snow is simply it's winter.
I don't see that any of this has anything to do with global warming. It's just the natural variability of weather and climate.
Seeger says the snow can be explained by the North Atlantic Oscillation. It's a normal weather pattern that pops up from time to time, bringing wet weather to the Northeast. Snow, is it global warming or not?
2 years is just not enough to make a claim about any kind of claim about climate change.
Isaac Held says winter patterns related to climate change are measured in decades, even centuries. And we've had these cold snaps before. Remember the winters of 1977 and 78? Much of the Midwest and Northeast were paralyzed for weeks. The National Guard was called in. And the winter hurricane of 1888 saw 50 inches or more fall on the Northeast, straining people in their homes for weeks.
We've always had extreme weather. We always will have extreme weather, but with global warming, we can expect to see more of these extremes.
So to the folks in Cullen's camp, the storm of the century that occurred in 1888, then again in 1978, are now coming more frequent, followed by a cyclone the size of Italy just weeks later. Brazil and Sri Lanka are still recovering from their record floods. Is the media getting it wrong? Perhaps Americans don't equate global warming with climate change. As for Richard Seeger, he is not a global warming denier. He believes it's happening. It's just not causing the snow.
I think that, the fact that we've had a snowy and cold winter is just one of those things that happens from just weather. Global warming's there. The planet will warm up. They will cause glaciers to melt. The seas will rise. All sorts of worrisome things will happen, but it's never going to get rid of the weather. And the weather's still going to be capable of giving us heat waves, still be capable of giving us cold winters every now and then.
So newsflash, it's going to be hot in the summer and cold in the winter? Is that a good prediction?
It'll be hotter in the summer and colder in the winter. The seasonal cycle will still carry on, yes.
So is the weather we are seeing truly extreme? And if so, is it climate change or is it just nature? Joining us for the mix, climatologist and senior fellow in environmental studies at the Cato Institute, Dr. Patrick Michaels. His new book, Climate Coup, is coming out a bit later this year. And in New York, Dr. Michio Kaku. He's a physics professor at the City University of New York and author of the forthcoming book, Physics of the Future. Thank you both for being with us.
Nice to be with you.
Patrick, it certainly seems like extreme weather. Is it?
Well, we can actually take a look at what we call circulation indices in the atmosphere. There's been a recent study over the entire 20th century. The hypothesis that they are becoming more variable or more accelerated just didn't stand up when it was looked at. And we can look at tropical cyclones, the feared hurricanes of the fall, and we can make hypotheses about changes in the Arctic ice like we saw in the piece before, and that would be related to changes in snowfall and cold. That's a very easy thing to test, to see what the correlation is between the amount of Arctic ice up there and the cold in the center of the country. That's never been done, and I suspect it would not hold up.
Okay, so these are normal weather patterns if you look at it over the long term.
Yeah, there's no major change that you can find.
Based in science. Dr. Kaku, what do you say? How does science explain what you think, which is that there are more frequent occurrences of severe weather?
Well, snowstorms in general are caused by dry, cold Arctic air coming down from Canada, hitting moist, warm air coming from the Gulf of Mexico. And there are two effects going on. One is a short-term effect. We have in the Atlantic Ocean, the North Atlantic oscillations around Iceland. In the Pacific, we have cold water around La Nina. And those two fluctuations are, in fact, apparently pulling down more cold Arctic dry air. However, we also have a long-term effect, an average effect, global warming, which is helping to create more moisture in the air. And the combination of more Arctic air coming down from the Arctic, hitting more moist air, on average, will create more snowstorms.
You just put forth a hypothesis that we would have a detectable increase in snowstorm frequency and magnitude in the center of North America. I don't think that's
Not
going to hold up if
frequency,
you look at...
magnitude, not
Right,
frequency.
and
We're
in
not
the
talking
19
about more hurricanes happening. We're talking about stronger hurricanes happening, but the frequency is probably going to be roughly the same.
But we've already tested that hypothesis on hurricanes with Maue's cyclone intensity index. And in fact,
No, we haven't,
the
because we're
accumulated...
talking about long-term effects now. Wait a minute. You make a very important mistake. We're not talking about now minor fluctuations here which take place year by year. Long-term average effects.
I agree
What's
with
happening
you.
now is consistent with global warming, but you can't say in any one particular year, aha, it's global
That's
warming.
correct.
It's an average effect.
That's correct. I was looking at the 20th century reanalysis. That's long-term. The cyclone intensity index begins in 1979. That's decades, and it's at its lowest value. These hypotheses are not doing very well.
Dr. Kaku, where do you tell the average person to look for information? There's such wide disparity in this debate.
Well, we can, of course, call NOAA, but the origin of the debate is very simple. I'm a physicist. We like to model things precisely using computers. But when it comes to the weather, it's chaotic. We have short-term effects, which are causing the sharp decrease in temperature, but we also have long-term effects, and it's very hard to separate the two sometimes, and these computer models are not 100% correct.
And how it leads you to the conclusion that we are seeing more severe weather and it is attributable to climate change.
The 5 years that I've lived here, we have had the longest dry period ever recorded, and we have had 2 record-breaking 24-hour rain events just in 5 years. Now, we can't say that any one event is because of climate change. There's always a good chance of something happening naturally. But what we can say is that with these type of events, climate change is loading the dice in favor of them happening.
The fact of the matter is, since the 1920s, extreme weather-related deaths around the world have dropped, hold on to your hats, 98%. In other words, we can talk all we want about these changes, but it's very clear that people are adapting them to the point that they're irrelevant.
Dr. Kaku, what do you say to that? Do you think that something needs to be done? Are we adapting?
If you take a look at China, we have massive drought in China affecting the world economy. I was in Brazil 3 weeks ago where we have massive mudslides, something that we haven't seen in 3 or 4 generations, killing 500 people. In Australia now, we have the flooding of the century going on with a huge chunk of Australia basically underwater. So global warming does not mean uniform warming. It means on average swings, more extremes, droughts in China, flooding in Australia, snowstorms in the United States, and it's an average effect.
Catherine Hayhoe, what do you say? Let's talk action. What do you say needs to be done, if anything?
There's no reason to do something just for climate change. There's lots of different reasons to find new homegrown energy sources so we don't have to depend on foreign oil, to create new ways of getting energy that give us clean air and clean water and a better future for our children. It's also important to conserve the resources that we have, just like our grandparents told us back in the 1930s, conserve our water, conserve our energy, take care of the planet that we've been given.
Patrick, is climate change as a cause for this severe weather a reason to do those things?
Now, what we really need to do is to preserve our adaptive capability, and that means that we have to have economies that are capable of dealing with the weather that we have and with the weather that we're going to get. Again, the fact that the number of deaths from extreme weather has dropped by 98% tells you that we are adapting and we are dealing with the changes that occur.
Dr. Kaku, do you think we need to do more?
I think we have to deal more. If people are dying less because of extreme weather, we're just getting better at it. But the long term is we may see some of our great cities underwater. And I don't want to see that happen. I don't want to see dikes around Manhattan. I don't want to have to see dikes around the great capitals of the world. And I don't want to see Greenland beginning to thaw out. So I think we should begin a process of energy efficiency, renewable technologies, going green, because it's prudent, because we need an insurance policy. Because if global warming is really kicking in on average, it's going to mean tremendous economic dislocation taking place.
All right, Dr. Michio Kaku, author of Physics of the Futures with the City University of New York. Thank you so much.
Homes lie empty, the river taking what those fleeing could not.
World ocean water temperatures are heating up to the warmest on record. The oranges and reds on this map show where temperatures are warmer than normal. In July, it was the hottest since record-keeping began 130 years ago.
Warm water is the fuel for hurricanes. So the warmer the water, the stronger a storm can get. Warmer the water, the stronger a storm can get.
It is official, 2012 was the hottest year in the United States since weather scientists started keeping records.
Scenes like this are becoming more common. Look at this NASA imagery showing the entire planet has gotten hotter in recent decades. Here in America, 2012 was not only the warmest year on record, but also the second most extreme, featuring tornadoes, wildfires, a massive drought, and Superstorm Sandy.
The worst drought in nearly half a century are now driving up food prices. The government is now saying next year groceries like milk, beef, chicken, and pork will cost consumers more.
They're going to go up, and they're going to go up big time.
It's so hot the government had to change its forecast maps, adding new shades of purple for temperatures possibly hitting 130 degrees.
With her house collapsing around her in the raging floodwaters, rescuers threw a lifeline to this woman in the mountains north of Rio de Janeiro. She grabbed her dog and with a leap of faith plunged into the surging waters. The rope held, but she couldn't hold on to the dog. As neighbors urged her on, she was raised to safety.
Hurricane Sandy crashing on shore, winds now at 90 miles per hour, and this storm is so big, so vast, 60 million Americans will feel its power.
This is not a time to be stupid. This is a time to try to save yourself and your family.
The unprecedented heat wave sweeping Russia continues unabated, with July already the hottest month on record. As a result of the heat, bog fires mean that Moscow is now choking in thick smog.
In southwest China, a crushing drought is threatening the drinking supply for over 50 million people.